Okay, so we're going to start by looking at utility theory. Okay, so again, utility is just another word for satisfaction. It's the want satisfying power of a good or a service. Okay, so utility just means satisfaction or usefulness. Okay, these are basically all synonyms for one another. And so that's basically how economists approach consumer choice. Is we assume that consumers are making choices in order to improve their satisfaction, right? And so that's basically what we're going to do. We're going to be conducting utility analysis. We're going to be analyzing consumer decision making based on the idea that consumers are trying to make themselves as best off as possible. They're trying to maximize their satisfaction or their utility. All right, so think about this. What if consuming an additional unit of something, of a good, generated negative marginal utility or negative additional satisfaction? Same thing. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that that's basically how it's changing total utility, right? And if it's negative, it means it's reducing total utility. So the negative change in the total utility from consuming an additional item, such as another scoop of ice cream when you're already kind of feeling full and maybe on the verge of feeling sick, that would be something that constituted negative marginal utility. So we pretty much are going to assume that consumers are going to avoid situations where they have negative marginal utility because it makes them worse off, right? That's basically what negative marginal utility means. If they consume it, then the consumer will be worse off if they do consume it. All right, so we have a unit of measurement for utility called a util. So just like degrees Fahrenheit is a measurement of temperature, is a unit of temperature, and feet is a unit of length, or meters are a unit of length. Util is the unit of utility. So this whole idea of utility was developed by a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham when he developed a school of thought called utilitarianism, where he basically figured or proposed that it should be society's goal to maximize social well-being, social utility. So if you're ever interested in reading some good philosophy, I recommend reading Jeremy Bentham and his utilitarianism theory. All right, so let's get into some more detail on what marginal utility is. Again, another way of thinking of it is it's just additional satisfaction. That's all that marginal utility means, additional satisfaction, right? Marginal means additional. Another word for utility is satisfaction. So it's basically the change in total utility, right? Since it's additional, it's the change in total utility due to a 1 unit change in the quantity of a good or service consumed. So if you eat one more potato chip, how does that change your total utility? Does it increase it? If it does, then you should eat it, and your marginal utility is positive. If it makes you feel worse off, then you shouldn't eat it, and it means that it has that additional potato chip has a negative marginal utility. Okay, so we can calculate it just like this. Its marginal utility is equal to the change in total utility. So the new utility minus the old utility, right? Let me switch to my doc cam. That's a really long transition. Let's see here. Go with black. All right, so marginal utility, sometimes abbreviated MU, equals the change in total utility. So total utility 2, the new total utility, minus the old or previous total utility, divided by the change in the number of units consumed. So we'll say Q2 minus Q1. And a lot of times this will just be 1. But Sometimes, not always. So if it's not 1, then we just need to find the difference here. In any case, that's how you calculate marginal utility. All right, so here's an example of showing you how to do that, right? So here's a numerical example. So we've got number of digital apps downloaded and utilized per week, going from 0 to 6. And then in the next column, we see the total utility or total satisfaction that this person derives from these apps. And so we can calculate the marginal utility as just the difference between total utility, since we're looking at the change in quantity as 1 for each row, going from 0 apps to 1 app, 1 app to 2 apps. Our change down here is just 1. So that's pretty straightforward. So then all we have to do is, since this is 1, all we have to do is find out what the change in total utility is. So for that first app, utility goes from 0 to 10. So the marginal utility of that first app is 10. As we go from the first app to the second app, the total utility goes from 10 to 16. So that second app provides a marginal utility of 6. And then you can see how the rest of them flow logically in the same way from there. And then it looks like the sixth app actually provides negative marginal utility. So you can see that going from the fifth app to the sixth app, total utility decreases, and that's because the marginal utility is negative. Okay, so this person should definitely not consume more than 5 apps. All right, so this is what total utility and marginal utility look like in comparison to one another. Okay, so this is exactly the same information that we saw in the previous table. But like I said, we see total utility on the top, and we can see that total utility reaches its maximum at the 4th and 5th app. And after the 5th app, it starts to go back down. So after the 5th app, this person starts to get worse off if they can continue to consume apps. Now you'll notice that total utility reaches its peak when marginal utility, which is at the bottom, when marginal utility becomes 0, right? At apps 1 through 4, marginal utility is positive, which means consuming additional apps will increase total utility. So you see that in apps 1 through 4, and I guess app 5 provides 0 marginal utility. But the apps 1 through 4, since the additional satisfaction is positive, it means that consuming more apps in that region increases total utility or total satisfaction. And then after that, when marginal utility becomes 0 and turns negative, total utility starts to decline. Okay, so that's the relationship between total and marginal. So there's a relationship between them, but they're obviously not the same thing. So make sure you understand the difference and how they are related. Okay, so what we just observed was that one thing that we observed is that marginal utility falls as more is consumed, and this is what's called diminishing marginal utility. Diminishing, of course, just meaning getting smaller. And so this is diminishing marginal utility is sometimes referred to as the law of diminishing marginal utility, because it's almost impossible to find anything where this is not true, where as we consume more of something, each additional unit provides us with less and less additional utility. So think about eating a box of Oreos, right? Which cookie tastes the best? The first one usually is the best, right? You are craving an Oreo or a cookie, something sweet, and so that first one really gives you a lot of satisfaction. And then you eat another one, and it tastes pretty good, but you've already got the taste of Oreo in your mouth, so it doesn't taste quite as good as the first one, still pretty good. And as you continue eating Oreos, each additional Oreo gives you less and less satisfaction. And at some point, you're probably going to stop eating Oreos, especially if you had an unlimited quantity, you wouldn't eat infinite Oreos. At some point you'd stop, right? Because you would start feeling full, and maybe even sick. So, so that's the idea behind diminishing marginal utility. And again, when marginal utility is zero, that's when utility reaches its maximum. Okay, just like we saw in the last two graphs. So, like I said, this law of diminishing marginal utility, it's just the idea that as more of any good or service is consumed, its extra benefits go down. So I encourage you to try and think of something. I challenge you to try and think of something that this is not the case, and maybe post this in your discussion post as well for this module. And if you think you've come up with something and you post it, I'll try to prove you wrong. Okay. But again, this is just the idea that we can also think of this as the fact that total utility, the increases in total utility are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So if I go back to this picture here, total utility on the top, right, the hill on the left side is increasing, but at a decreasing rate. So the slope is getting flatter and flatter until we reach the peak where the slope is exactly flat. So that's also what's going on with diminishing marginal utility. And like I said, this is so hard to refute that we actually call it a law. So there you go.